Thank you, everyone. I think we've almost got the last stragglers. Thank you very much. I hope you are enjoying the forum so far. Welcome to the second panel. This is Deepfakes, Revenge Porn and the Law. My name is Zoe Hawkins. I'll be your moderator today. Quick background on me. I'm from Australia. I've worked in online safety policy for the Australian government and at Amazon, and I'm really excited to be moderating today. So I'm going to jump in and introduce our wonderful expert panel who are here to share all their insights with us. So to my left, I've got Dan Mount, who is the Principal for Online Safety Policy at Ofcom, so our regulator, as I just joked. Dan leads the development of Ofcom's regulatory approach to tackling online fraud and scams, linked to their forthcoming duties under the UK Online Safety Bill. So Dan has previously worked on internet technology and digital inclusion policy issues in Parliament, the third sector, a digital trade association, and private sector consultancy. He holds an MA in International Relations from the Institute for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and a BA in Politics from Durham University. So welcome, Dan. And we also have Jyothsna Gurumurthy, who's a second-year DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford's Faculty of Law. Her research views regulation of deepfakes and AI-generated content through the lens of disinformation and identity rights of the subjects involved in doctored media. She's passionate about technology, law, and music. She holds a BA and with honours from Nalsar University of Law in Hyderabad, India, and a BCL from the University of Oxford. She's originally from Bangalore, India, and has just arrived back yesterday, I think, from India, so doing well. And lastly but not least, we've got Colette Allen, who was actually at the OAI only last year, so pleasure to have you back, where she focused her research on deepfake, non-consensual intimate image abuse. Colette currently hosts the newscast segment on the Media Law podcast and authors the Inform blog weekly roundup, which both focus on media, privacy, data protection, and internet law. Colette was called to the Bar of England and Wales in November 2022. So congratulations and thanks for joining us as well. Thanks to the other panel. So similar to the last panel, I'm going to facilitate a bit of a guided conversation for the next sort of 40 minutes or so. We're going to cover deepfake trends, their legal implications and solutions, and maybe some future legal considerations so that we can look around some corners. So I encourage my panelists to respond to each other, disagree, makes for a richer discussion. And similar to the last panel, we will leave time at the end for audience questions. And this audience seemed to have a lot of questions, so I'll keep that in mind in terms of time allocation. So I'm going to throw out some questions and you guys just jump in when it seems right for you. But I think before we jump into the revenge porn element of this conversation, probably good to take a step back and talk about what do we mean when we talk about deepfakes. I think we've talked a bit in the previous session for those that were down here about misinformation and generative AI in that context. I'd love to throw to the panel just to frame the conversation for us. When people talk about deepfakes, it's a bit of a buzzword. What does that mean to you? And why is it something we should really care about? And is it different to other forms of misinformation?
I'm happy to
jump in.
Yeah. Well, for my thesis, deepfakes is something that I'm defining as intentional and malicious. But deepfakes are not necessarily that. They have beneficial uses as well. So you can use it in a movie when an actor dies before the shoot is completed, and using the previous shoot that you have already recorded, transforming it to use it in the future scenes would be a deepfake, and that's a beneficial use. You can resurrect a historical figure like John F. Kennedy to give a speech that he was supposed to give before he died, unfortunately, when he was assassinated in Dallas. He could be resurrected and give that speech that he was supposed to give had he not been assassinated, and that could be used in a classroom to teach children. So these are the beneficial uses of deepfakes. I think I would define deepfakes as anything that is generated with the help of an algorithm. So it's different from a simple video editing technique where Tom Hanks in Forrest Gump was edited to be shaking the hand of a president. That's not a deepfake. I would say a deepfake involves the intentional swapping of faces of real individuals. So you can also have deepfakes of fictional persons. this person does not exist.com is something that generates artificial images of people that don't exist. And you can make deep fakes out of that by swapping their faces. But I think for the purpose of the law, we need to have it grounded in an actual individual, and probably more than one individual. So it would be swapping of their faces and making them appear to do something that they would never do in reality. And that's where the deep and the fake part of it comes into the game.
Well, I'd add to that where, and I certainly agree. I guess the distinction for me between, say, deep fakes and like cheap fakes, which would be the sort of Photoshop cropping and then sort of transposing crudely with a bit of smoothing of the edges of a face, is, you know, often, typically, not always, the result of generative adversarial network-driven processes which have a sort of competition, obviously, between a generative element and a discriminating element, and it's only when the generative element manages to fool the discriminating element against what they produce matches the original data set that it goes through, and that's sort of what produces the kinds of products which are very convincing in comparison to some of those sort of crude Photoshop jobs. But I think, I think there's tremendous positive potential for this technology in many ways. Just watching foreign language films where you make the actor actually, speak the voice and the lip movements correspond to that language would be quite a sort of bridge building, value-added proposition. But at the same time, I think US Department of Homeland Security in 2021 released a sort of scary report which was saying that that deepfake sort of technology represents a clear and present danger to national security, the economy, society, all the rest of it. And I think that maybe those threats are emerging, and the risk of state-sponsored associated actors using social media and deepfake profiles to undertake influence operations. There's certain commentators who've commented on that, but I think that at the moment one of the primary use cases still seems to be, linking it back to the topic. Is the
we can start topic too.
No. I'm just trying to get my brownie points when I managed to join those dots. But there is the sort of generating of non-consensual deepfake, intimate images, pornography, etc. And I really wanted to remember this stat. I think the Sensity AI is said that 95% of all the video content they discovered or identified since 2018 was sort of the sort of deepfake, non-consensual, intimate variety. So I guess that means that all those other use cases will rise, but right now the sort of the deepfake revenge porn style attack is kind of the primary one.
Living up to the name of the internet, and that being what it's for, I guess. Colette, anything to add on that?
No, I think they've covered all of it. The only thing I would add is the stat I have is 97%.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I saw that stat as well.
And 100% of those were women, and that 100% of them were not consensual as well.
Well, that's a good segue onto a question of, my next question was going to be on, the concept of what a deepfake is, what are the trends we're seeing around it? Dan, you've already sort of touched on a few issues, talked about influence operations and this issue that we're going to narrow in a little bit further on in terms of non-consensual pornography deepfakes. Love the panel to just reflect on, the trends, both in terms of who's this affecting, the harms, any comments as to how we should understand what is we've talked about there's benefits and positive versions of applications of this technology, but if we're zooming in on the problem, what is the problem? Who's it affecting?
Well, I guess I'll take on from what I just said. As I say, 97% of the deepfakes that were surveyed in 2021 were pornographic. 100% of those were women. It's a deeply gendered phenomenon. It also often targets minority voices as well. And I think one of the harms that seems to be missed in a lot of the talk around legislative reform, especially in the UK, is the freedom of expression element for women that the deepfakes impact. And we can talk more about this later, but I'll just briefly set it out now. Part of my research at the OII was on the way that deepfake intimate image abuse interferes with the subject's Article 10 rights to freedom of expression. It does that in two ways. One is the European Convention accepts that our relationship with our body and the way that we show our body and express our body to other people is part of our identity and part of how we realise ourselves as social beings. And so that's something that's very important and the court will seek to protect. When you chop and change a woman's body, you tell them that they are nothing but objects that can be swapped at will of someone else, and you fundamentally disrupt the interpretation that that person has of their body. So that's deeply traumatic for the person who's subjected to the deepfake. But the threat of it too also leads into issues around pluralism, and that's the second freedom of expression element to this, which is the very reality of deepfake abuse weaponizes everyday online expression for women, because even having a public social media account exposes you to the threat of being subjected to this form of abuse. There have been multiple studies done that show that in the face of online abuse, women tend to withdraw from the online space. So what you do with this form of abuse is create a network of male voices that unite together to troll women and push them off an online space, either directly through the result of a deepfake, porn or revenge porn in general, or just, as I say, the threat of it. And you then create spaces which are male-dominated, and you take women out of those spaces, which is just damaging for pluralism in general, which is something that's very important for a democratic society. So those are the two key elements of freedom of expression which lawmakers don't really seem to understand. In the Law Commission report that came out in 2022 that recommended that we criminalise deepfakes in the UK, the only mention of freedom of expression, it's a 500-page report, the only mention of it is in relation to the perpetrator's rights. And the justification for not creating a making offence, but just criminalising the sharing of the image, is it interferes with the perpetrator's freedom of expression rights to sexual fantasy. And I'm going to stop talking because I've spoken a lot now, but and there's a lot in there that we can unpack. But I think when we think about what the problem is and what the harms are, what a really important thing to realise is that it's not just about, is to fully appreciate the trauma that the person experiences and also the phenomenon as a whole and the impact it has on freedom of expression, because that's a harm that we really need to recognise in order to create proper solutions for it.
Actually, a related example to that point, which I think is really important, is, so I think there was a reporter, I think a female reporter for Vice magazine, I'm not sure you call it magazine anymore, but for Vice, who basically did a test case where she got in touch with somebody on an internet forum and asked them to create a deep fake of her. Well, they didn't know who she was, so they didn't know whether someone asking for them to do this on behalf of, where the provenance was, but she basically submitted, I think it was a 15-second Instagram story that she made to this person on the forum, not revealing whether she's the person in it, and it cost $30 for them, and she chose to put it in a Pornhub video, and it cost $30, and then sure enough, sooner or later you get that return. And the thing is, so the source material of that is like 15-second video, and they apparently only used like 350 different single frames to train the system to be able to do that. And it's like, well, who hasn't got, I mean, maybe not me, because I'm getting a little bit older, but like, everybody else usually has 15 seconds of video on the internet, and the idea that that's the threshold at which you become vulnerable is I think, a chilling of self-expression.
I think that's a really great point, and what you're both implicitly talking about, I think, in terms of trends is, I think originally when some of these issues started coming up, it was often sort of female celebrities and actresses. I think it was Kristen Bell and a few others that kind of notably experienced this. But what we're seeing, and I'd love to, the comment that's coming through is obviously this is reaching everyday individuals as well, based on the fact that it's a smaller they need a small online footprint, and see that's getting picked up and taken advantage of. We don't want to see that discouraging participation. And so I guess clearly it's not affecting people evenly. We're looking at the legal implications. And Jyothsna, do you want to talk a little bit about your research and the kind of the legal implications that you're seeing from that space?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not just affecting the person in the deepfake, it's also affecting you as a viewer of the deepfake, because you are consuming a unit of misinformation without knowing that you're consuming a unit of misinformation, and it could also be disinformation if it's intentional, but let's not get into difference between that. But so what my thesis is, what I'm looking at is defining the harms of a deepfake and why deepfakes require specific regulations. So you can just say that deepfakes are kind of like misinformation, just pass laws that deal with misinformation broadly, disinformation broadly, and you should be able to cover deepfakes. But the problem with deepfakes specifically are that they are units. At one instance, they're able to affect the person in the deepfake as well as the viewer of the deepfake. So, I mean, from what I've done in my research, I haven't been able to find, there may be other cases, I do have that caveat in my head, but not as popular as a deepfake, where you can affect an entire society and a particular individual equally. You may not be able to quantify the harm equally, because obviously the trauma that a woman in a revenge porn deepfake faces will be more than me watching that revenge porn when I'm not involved in it. Maybe as a woman I may feel something, but not as much as the woman in the deepfake. But the fact is that society at large is being affected. And that's where the law has to step in. And regulation has to affect both these, has to address both of these harms at the same instance if that's possible. So one way we could probably go about that is situating this right or the remedy or whatever in the right to identity. So if I as an individual have a stronger right over my right to digital self-representation, if I know, say for example, this just off the top of my head, if Ofcom just gives me a seal of approval that this image is authentically Jyothsna, and I put that up on Instagram. It's kind of like the provenance solution that we heard in the previous panel, where you have a source that you know where that image is coming from, and that's grounded in the right to identity. It's because I have a right to control the way I'm viewed online. Anyone who uses that will know that it has come from an approved regulatory authority or an approved origin on the source is established, and if it's used in anything, then you know that it's fake or not fake. But that again brings up questions of, has it been consented to? So they could use the original image without my consent, and non-consensual use is again the problem. And then I'm just going to be blabbering, but another thing just to confuse you further is consent sometimes may not even be important, because I could consent to being in a pornographic video, but it's still wrong because it comes under the obscenity laws of a jurisdiction. So I can't consent in that case. So even though I have a right to my identity, legally I should not be consenting to it, because it's affecting the society at large as I'm consenting to putting out obscene information out there. So is consent really important? Yes, it is, but not in some cases. So, yeah.
That's a really interesting point, and I hadn't thought about it from that angle, but I had consent down as a topic for us to discuss, because I'm curious as to how the panel thinks about the increasing popularity of the apps like Lensa, where users are not just consenting to submit their own images, but they're paying to have their sort of digital avatars made. And it's not full-blown pornography, but I know that a lot of the commentary has been around that the images being produced, particularly of women, are very sexualized, and that reveals the sort of data that modelling is trained on. Do we need to reflect on how the awareness of users, that they're sort of training different types of models, and how that is potentially going to be misused in some of these contexts? Is there a link between that kind of consensual training of these avatar models and some of the deepfake technology we need to worry about?
Yes, I think there is definitely a link. I think before I answer that question, there's something I want to clarify that you just said. You can consent to being filmed in a pornographic video, and that's part of, again, the subject's freedom of expression rights, and your right to sexual autonomy and to curate your own sexual identity. So I'm just a bit confused by the point you made about you can't really consent to it because you're creating something that's obscene.
I think that would again come under the sharing versus making distinction.
Right.
I can't share it. That would be an offense. But under obscenity laws.
Right. I guess it depends where you are. Fine. And yeah, with the avatar thing, I think it's tricky, and I think I don't want to speak too much on it, because I think it slightly distracts from the main issue that we're talking about, which I think when you both gave your definition of the deepfake, the element of realism was the key thing that came out of it. the avatars thing is, I mean, at the end of the day, they're cartoons. People are always going to be sick and do things that sexualize other people because we're humans and we're animals and we think we're more sophisticated than we are. I think the cartoon
that's the takeaway from
that. That's the takeaway. Is that we think we're smart, we're really not. And that's fine.
Yeah.
But, you know, consent is key. I think it's inevitable that that's going to happen. The problem with the deepfakes is the fact that it's so realistic, and it's a whole other level of violation when you see yourself in a very realistic video depicted in that way, performing a sexual act on someone. And that the video itself is always inherently non-consensual because you didn't consent to that specific sexual act. So even if it's not, there are often deepfakes that do depict rape, but even if it's not depicting rape, the person who is subjected to the video is seeing themselves being raped. And so that's a much more traumatic thing that I think the attention of lawmakers should be focused on, because the avatar issue goes closer to the artistic license and the freedom of expression rights of people who create them, which we do need to take into consideration, because people do have rights to create artistic things and to fantasize and stuff. And the issue is that their rights to express their sexual fantasies in that way become a problem when it gets really realistic.
So spectrum of the realism, and I guess how do you, in legal terms, quantify that as a sort of average reasonable person test?
It depends. Well, I guess it depends what form. So I know that one of the things that you wanted to talk about is the possible legal routes that victim survivors might have. Depending on which route you go down, there'll be different legal tests. I think with all of them, the fact that it actually looks like you is going to be really important to cross that threshold. Anything else, you're not really going to be able to claim that it's misuse of private information or it's your data or it's defamation or anything like that.
Excellent. Well, it's a really helpful way to sort of situate the different issues that we're speaking about. And as you just mentioned, we can move on to speaking about some of the, what are current solutions that are being debated. And maybe, Dan, I thought maybe you could speak to us a little bit about your, understanding of the proposed UK approach under the latest iteration of the Online Safety Bill, and if that would give any new powers to Ofcom to deal with this issue.
So yes, I think it in all the likelihood would, although I haven't seen. So I think in last November, in fact, 2022, seems so recent. The government announced that they were going to amend the Online Safety Bill to sort of explicitly criminalise the effectively sharing of deepfake intimate images and video. I haven't seen the drafting associated with that, so it's difficult to sort of. But obviously, that would provide a hook, certainly in terms of the Online Safety Bill, and obviously Ofcom is following royal assent to the Online Safety Bill. Will take on duties and powers as regulator for online safety. I think, so I guess that can be seen as a positive development. I think I don't want to be too backward looking and get myself into too many legal knots, but I think there's just an interesting dimension where, you've got things like the Malicious Communications Act 1988 and the Communications Act 2003, which of course I love because it established Ofcom. But both of those, they include offences in relation to grossly offensive communications, menacing or threatening communications, false communications, which technically, if you look at those, think, well, that should just cover all of that, really. But of course, because the terminology is so vague, technically you could use that to prosecute two consenting adults exchanging explicit text messages. So, in a sense, these laws were either created before the internet even existed and nearly no one had a computer at home, or created still when Twitter and the iPhone and Facebook didn't exist. So there's that element, and then there's the Criminal Justice and Courts Act in 2015. So I'm stealing your lines. I can hand it over to you because I think you know these more. Which basically was designed to deal with revenge pornography, and seemingly also applies to deepfakes because it applies to photos or images or films which have been altered in any way. But it doesn't, because the tests in it, in terms of being of a sort of private or sexual nature, the way it's defined in the Act, I think doesn't apply So I'll give you an example where if someone had a picture of their ex-partner and in a sort of intimate position, and without their consent polish that and change their hair colour, that would be in scope. But if you just took a publicly available picture, a headshot, and put that into another context, say a pornographic video, that would not be within scope, because the original thing that you took doesn't meet those thresholds. So I guess it's confusing, because you'd think the law already covers this, but it kind of, for various reasons, it struggles to. And then you have a specific legislation in relation to revenge porn, which you think would cover it, but it doesn't quite. And then we're now sort of onto this phase with the online safety bill.
Yeah, that's interesting, and obviously the move towards criminalisation is a very positive development. Do we think, I mean, I'm curious, presumably the people that are perpetrating this aren't exactly easy to identify online. How do we think about, how does the law deal with that? These people might be anonymous in their creation and distribution of this content.
Yeah, so I think enforceability is a big problem with deepfakes, because you can post it online anonymously, but also once you post it, even if you've posted it, I mean, it's very difficult to figure out how to take it down. So for example, even if someone knows that I've posted a deepfake on a particular channel, they can ask me to take it down from that channel, but someone else can use that and post it on some other channel. And China has recently come up with, actually it came into effect on Jan 10th, 2023, a regulation that deals with synthetic content and the technology that deals with it. So they're not looking at specific, what I found is deepfake legislations around the world are looking at specific kinds of deepfakes. So you either look at pornographic deepfakes, you look at deepfakes in elections, and content-specific deepfake legislation, which could be problematic because they have enforcement issues. I mean, the Deepfake Accountability Act, which is a bill in the US, says that any deepfake should have a label attached to it. But how do you enforce that? I could just put up a deepfake and no one would ever know that I've done that. So China has instead looked at the technology behind deepfakes, and they're saying anything which is generated by an AI, if it contravenes certain markers that they've put up, then that would be illegal. So I think that's an interesting way, but the problem with that is that brings up a huge potential for censorship, and freedom of expression is a massive issue, but I think each jurisdiction has its own factors that it considers important to it. And I think along with the law, so that's why, because of the enforceability concern, more than governments and states and regulators coming up with laws, I think platforms have a massive responsibility to deal with this at their stage. So like Facebook said, or Meta said, that they wouldn't, they would ban deepfake technology on their platform. Google's collaborative AI tool said that it started nerfing codes that try to come up with deepfake videos, saying that we can't allow you to generate code that generates a deepfake. So platforms do have a responsibility, and I think they will play an important role in bridging this gap between the lack of enforceability and the law. I think so. I'm being optimistic about it, but open to it.
Well, this is great, because my next question was, do platforms have a role to play in these issues? So I think we're on the same page. And I guess, yeah, I think it's how do you obviously we'd like to see platforms proactively taking these positions, but, maybe there's a sort of legal requirement that, would that be useful for governments to consider, sort of requiring that, if you're talking about Meta, what's a good version of the China law that isn't potentially, ripe for misuse in terms of censorship? Like, how do we get that balance right between saying, the platforms have to intervene without combating that freedom of speech issue?
Yeah, I think they already do have certain duties to moderate illegal or harmful content, and that's where the law's definition of what illegal or harmful is can help in making sure that it's not a very censored activity. But being a lawyer, I say that it's irritating that this is such a subjective definition. Anything can be illegal, at the same time anything can be legal, if you define it in the way that you want to. So that's not an answer, but it's just
from the enforcement point of view, and I'm not trying to style myself as an expert on generative adversarial networks, but my understanding is that technology which is used to create deepfakes is also the best technology to detect deep fakes in a sense. And so you've got to set yourself with a kind of technological arms race where ultimately the model which has, or the neural networks which have the best training data and the best compute power are going to win. And that starts to, you don't have to be a regulator to start to think, well, maybe the platforms have the most compute power and data, so they obviously are an integral part in any effective solution. But then one can imagine a role for, obviously government and civil society in that piece. I think I'd also say that, one of the issues with, now whether or not it's scalable to run, a generative adversarial network on every single item of uploaded content in real time before anyone sees it is another question which I won't try and answer because that sounds quite expensive. But ultimately, in the fields of if you look at other harms and industry practices like child sexual abuse material and terrorism, you have sort of digital fingerprinting of images and video like hashing. And I guess if there was a sense, and I think you pointed to that already, but I guess the advantage of that is, although it might not be as preventative, ultimately confirmed identified deepfakes could then potentially be removed, and a lot of the problem is the resurgence of material which reharms the victim over and over again.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads on to something that I was going to say in relation to that enforceability between bridging the law and the enforceability of it. If we think about what the purpose of the law is, there are kind of two purposes. One is an expressive function, as it sets society's standards, so it says like this is behaviour we'll tolerate and this is what we don't tolerate. The second purpose is to equip victims or claimants with the tools to achieve redress. And so one of the ways that we can bridge it, as well as platform liability, is just giving victim survivors better tools. And that comes either through criminal law or civil redress. One of the things that I think the Law Commission suggestions to amend the Section 33 of the 2015 Act to add a deepfake element to the revenge porn, and also the Online Safety Bill suggestions around deepfakes. Something that I think they miss is the opportunity to create assigning almost like assigning the copyright to the victim survivor, because that gives them a lot of power to chase ISP, internet service providers, and website operators. Because currently, the perpetrator owns the copyright to the deepfake. So you end up in a situation under current law that the perpetrator has more legal rights than the victim survivor. We have, if money's involved, platforms get very good at working out solutions. There are very good ways to detect pirated content and to stop pirated movies and songs and stuff being accessed and being shared. And that's kind of regulated through the e-commerce directive. If we had a similar thing for victim survivors and an approach on platforms and a responsibility on platforms like we do for piracy to remove these videos, it could be done. It could be done very quickly. And as you say, the kind of hashing that's available already for child pornography is there. The technology is there. It's just a matter of prioritising it.
That's right. And it's not just, obviously, and as the references that you made, there's still a long way to go, even on the terrorism and child sex abuse use of those concepts and those the hashing technology, and trying to get that to trickle down from the biggest platforms. So hopefully there's a strong uptake and we can move to that approach in this space as well. And Dan, you mentioned talking about, where to next, I guess, which is going to lead us to maybe a final question. We can leave time for audience Q&A. Are there any other next iterations of this harm space that we haven't thought about? That, how do we make sure that the laws that we're designing right now will kind of be future-proof in this space? I'm thinking the metaverse, or the other elements of this that we haven't thought of, and we're going to end up with, like you said, the laws that are only, 8 years old that already don't make sense.
I guess maybe because some of the sort of, the harms are starting to puncture the sort of popular consciousness and those are policymakers and the media. So the solution's a bit behind. So it's easy to extrapolate where the harms might go, maybe. But they're still always obviously difficult. But there are many potential avenues. I think one is that I guess you can take obviously a sort of child predator could use this sort of technology to have real-time sort of facial and voice translation to look like a child, which would be quite disturbing. And then the flip side of that is that children could use that to game the increasing use of sort of facial recognition and biometrics to be used to access inappropriate or harmful content. So those sort of seem, you know, in principle possible. I think on the metaverse side, it's interesting because it in a way comes back to the avatar question, where if everybody starts to increasingly immerse themselves in sort of real-time 3D digital co-experiences where they're represented by, you know, a high-resolution avatar, and that kind of becomes them, and we increasingly unplug from real life and mostly live in the metaverse, then suddenly you get deepfakes of those avatars, which causing, you know, harm in sort of new meta ways on top, which is sort of another.
And then maybe we are the cartoon by that point.
Yeah. That's happening apparently. People get groped to the metaverse. What's that?
Yeah.
What's wrong with
I
everyone?
know. Oh dear.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to bring back, I mean, to go back to the previous point, I think the detection tools are arms race. Maybe one way that the law can hope to keep up with it is, say, that technology, that detection tool should not be made open source. Only particular regulators or particular platforms can have access to it. So that if it's, because if it's made open source, it is the arms race, right? Like the generating technology learns from the detection tool and then just keeps getting better. So maybe one way would be to hold on to the detection tools and give it only to authenticated channels or something like that. But I mean, it's only going to get better. It's only going to get more sophisticated. Right now, we have it's possible for real-time deepfake videos to also take place and to be generated. But these real-time deepfake videos don't get the angular parts of the face right. So if you move, it sort of smudges, so you can figure out that it's a deepfake. But you can't figure that out in an audio deepfake because there is no angular inquiry in an audio deepfake. So it's only a matter of time before the real-time video technology realizes that this angular thing is an issue and then gets better. So I think if we hold on to detection tools and make them go through authenticated channels, that will help.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's inevitable that the technology will always outpace the law. And so when you're thinking about future-proofing legislation, I think the only thing you can really do is try and go back to your core principles as what it is you're actually trying to protect. And when you go back to things like, you know, your convention rights and your fundamental human rights principles, and analyse whatever issue that you're trying to legislate through that lens, you get a much more holistic understanding of the problem, and you draw out things like the freedom of expression element, which I mentioned before, which hasn't seemed to be appreciated so far. And then I think when you start thinking about it in that sense, you can draft legislation that it's just going to be inherently better. It's going to offer better protection, even if the technology moves forward, because as you were saying with the kind of Communications Act and stuff 20 years ago, at their core, they were trying to protect malicious interaction between people, because that is just something that shouldn't be allowed in a kind of free-for-all. If you're thinking properly, you can just capture the essence of what it is you're trying to protect and draft legislation that does that. It just takes a little bit more effort.
There you go, that's a note to take. Tech-agnostic, principle-based legislation seems like the way to go. Okay, well, questions from the audience, if we have any. I've got one hand. I don't know if there's a roaming. I'll be the roaming mic.
Hi, I was just wondering, I know that a couple of studies have shown that like awareness of deepfake technology sometimes, especially in like political contexts, actually makes people doubt authentic media. And it kind of raises a point of like cheap fakes actually being a much more effective and much more difficult to enforce upon problem. And I kind of wanted to ask you kind of your ideas for solutions, and if it's like what is the responsibility of platforms as that puts them in a tricky position if like one part of like if it's authentic video and then maybe 15 seconds are sped up to change or even like a snippet of the audio is changed to change the story. And then also a second question, which is something that I'm curious about, is in relation to CSAM content that is computer generated, so like child pornography and things like that. And it doesn't actually involve the identity of a real child. Like, what are the legal implications of that? I know in the US, if it isn't of a real person, I don't think you can actually enforce upon it. So I was just wondering, for those two questions, what you guys thought.
Can I grab the first one to dodge the second one? So I think part of your point relates to one of the other points that was made in the previous panel down here, which I think relates to sort of the pendulum side, where ultimately what you might want to instill in internet users, the general public, is greater sort of awareness and resilience to these threats, but actually that can flip over into a continuous sort of posture of crippled sort of doubt and uncertainty and disbelief in nearly everything. Because if you can trust nothing, then, and with corresponding problems with trust in institutions and in the fabric of the information environment, etc. And I guess, in terms of the solution to that, it's a tricky one. But I guess one part could be more, as I think the previous panel said, towards the sort of media literacy side, but obviously that would have to be almost moving beyond judging veracity and accuracy based on what you see and what you hear, because you can't always trust that, but then looking at the kind of metadata associated with the content, looking at the provenance and origin and contextual clues around it to arrive at a slightly more informed decision, just going, it's on video, so it's real. And I think Ofcom research has shown that certainly, I think children, or at least I can't remember the age group, something like 16 to 25-year-olds, when they look for an answer to a question on the internet, I go and read a really long, boring academic journal article and look at it and go, very interesting. They don't ever want to look at that. They want a video, because if you see a video, then it really happened and it's the truth. And if you're looking at, some long-winded article, nah. So I think definitely, if you're taking an optimistic route, the idea of a more evolved media literacy, which means you do have to do a bit more digging in terms of assessing the provenance of what you're looking at, but it'll be worth it in the end.
Thank you. Okay, is anyone going to
I just want, if you wanted to answer the second question, because I think it's a really good one, and I immediately wanted to see what the Protection of Children Act says in relation to if it's not a real child. And there's nothing there. What it said, the wording of the text is, it's an offence to take or permit or to be taken any indecent photo or pseudo photograph of a child. So it would come down to an interpretation of what a pseudo photograph means. And does that mean just deep fake of a real child, or just any pseudo photograph of a child being depicted? I don't know. It's not exactly. This is a good question.
Thank you. Questions? That was a quick hand.
Thank you. So you talked a bit about liability for platforms and distributor liability for sort of hosting or distributing potentially illegal content. I'm curious though if you have thoughts on the feasibility of liability for AI service providers on sort of the creation end of non-commercial imagery, and whether is that a possible route to maybe the most technically advanced users could still find ways around or roll their own, but the vast majority of people would probably not be able to access the technology if large corporations that have built these AIs had sort of significant liability for users who misuse them. Or is that sort of a bad idea because we don't regulate Photoshop for misinformation, or there's some people argue that the tools should not be regulated the same way as distribution, but maybe these AI tools are different, or maybe it's the same. I'm curious.
Definitely, I think that's a good solution. So it's a good solution to incorporate checks into the technology itself. So deep face and face app, all these things which are accessible to a general user on their smartphone. If that has a particular check that doesn't allow them to create malicious content using that app, that would be helpful. But then the only problem with that is you're giving the power of censorship and the power of restricting speech to private powers. That's already the problem when you give it to platforms. But platforms in today's age are sort of assuming a pseudo-state-like agency sort of status. So if, we're going towards accepting that maybe they have the responsibility and hence they can have the power, but if you give this to just any private corporation or any private power, that would be a huge problem. But it does seem to be the most effective to curb it if everyone just adopts AI ethics that don't allow malicious content to be out there.
That was a great question. We're going to go for the next one, and Pete, can you pass to Rachel right now?
Yeah, kind of building off of that. So back in like the very beginning of your discussion, you mentioned some positive benefits potentially of deepfake technology, and I think it goes to Peter's point of like, okay, so it's different from maybe something like Photoshop, which we've experienced does have benefits that are quite obvious. And I think the examples of bringing back a speaker posthumously to give a speech, right, or to resurrect one's loved one, I think that those are very complicated ethically regarding consent, which was talked about a lot. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit more and maybe complicate that as a benefit and potentially add some other positives that you see for deepfake technologies to sort of justify them as being an agnostic technology that's not malicious in its nature.
So another positive example that I love this example because it's in advertising, and I think it's really interesting. It's an Indian example, so if there are any Indians out there who know who Shah Rukh Khan is, who's an actor in Bollywood. He was, for one of the ad campaigns of Cadbury, they used just a basic outline of him to, he says, please go and shop for the festival of Diwali, which is a big festival in India. He says, go and shop at your local store, as opposed to saying a particular brand like, I don't know what, like Reliance, which is another big brand in India. Instead of saying that, he says, go to your local grocery store and buy sweets, instead of buying it from this big bakery. And the way it comes about is that Cadbury released, I think it was called Reliance AI, or I don't remember the name, Sensity AI, I don't know. I'll get back on that, but I can't remember the name. They put out a form, Cadbury put out a form which allowed local store owners and local brands and small-scale industries to put up their data on that form. And they put up their name, their contact details, the kind of products they offer, and at the end of it, if they put generate, if they click on generate, an ad for their store is generated with this actor sponsoring or endorsing their goods. And that would then be circulated on a local community WhatsApp group. And if someone sees an actor saying go and shop from that particular store, they'd obviously think that, okay, this store is being endorsed by Shah Rukh Khan, let's go and shop there. Whereas it was just deepfake. And I mean, this was in 2021, I think, where people are still skeptical about deepfakes, but they were even more skeptical about deepfakes back then. And the company came out saying that this isn't a deepfake, it's just a clever use in advertising, but it is a deepfake. The technology was a GAN. And I think that's a really beneficial use, and it's quite interesting. And it was done with his consent. It was done with the shop owner's consent. So I think that's a good use case.
It's a really interesting example. It's interesting though, because even the way you phrased it was that they might think that he actually endorsed that particular shop.
Then my issue with that was that's a harm to the viewer, because they think that's real.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm like, no, but I mean, it may be beneficial to the shop owners and commerce in general, but it's not beneficial to the user.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think the lady right behind you was first, and then there was one over. We'll get one over there as well.
So there's another kind of harm that I want to talk to about is that when these deepfakes or the artificially generated create, they are also really enforcing the beauty standards, like usually, and that causes a harm for young girls. And for instance, it would always produce an avatar that is white skinned, blue eyed, where encouraging girls to bleach their skins, especially in the global south where we don't have. So, do you think these kind of harms should be regulated within the tools as well?
I was going to just respond with an anecdotal example which matches that, which is, so obviously I work in online safety, and I try and use a lot of apps which no one of my actual demographic uses, to kind of make sure I understand what we're what we're looking at. And I have I guess my 11-year-old daughter, but I think she was 9 or so, she's really interested in social media stuff, and I said, well, you'll get like a phone when you're like 13, but I'll show you how this stuff works. Well, yeah, actually probably more like 30 probably, and so we're looking at things like Snapchat and TikTok, but then Snapchat obviously got all these kind of AR lenses and VR lenses, which are obviously really cool, and there's all the kind of ability to vomit rainbows, etc., which who could ever turn that down? But we did look a lot, and there's a few beauty filters and all the rest of it. And so she didn't have she had supervised access, as in I was holding the phone, etc. But after about a month or so of doing that every so often, she was saying, "Yeah, I don't really like my skin, And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she goes, "Well, just because like I like it the way it looks in those filters, where it's just really smooth, and also she's got freckles, and so already just through supervised exposure, she's got the impression that her skin's wrong. So that gives you a sense of the influence that has now." The extent to which it should be suffer from immediate regulation, obviously Ofcom doesn't make the legislation, that's the government and parliament, but ultimately it's certainly an area where, whether it's regulation or, education or media literacy, it's clearly an important thing for, people like my daughter, I think.
Thank you. And then we've got, I think, possibly a last question over there.
Just quickly, revenge porn aside for a minute. Talk about elections, but what other kind of videos do you think news organisations need to be aware of that might come up in the next couple of years? What kind of subject and topics do you think deepfakes might target?
It can be anything.
Yeah.
Literally, it could be any topic. And I think the scary thing about it being used in elections is it could very easily sway votes. So it's already being used in elections, which is why I think most of the laws are targeting elections at the first instance. In India, the ruling party used deepfake technology to have a particular candidate speak in languages that he can't actually speak in. But then his campaign video was translated into those languages using deepfake technology to address the demographic, which would then be influenced and then vote for them. But they thought that he could actually speak their language, and that's why they were voting for him. But that's why it's problematic. So it need not be the content of what he's saying. It could just be the way that you view a video. You think that it's real. And
I think in the political sphere, I think what I was about to say I'm looking forward to. I'm certainly not looking forward to it, but obviously, if you're trying to detect a deepfake, you'll be looking for various high-frequency sort of art and sort of artifacts, various details in it. Now, obviously, from a political point of view, you could take a video, which is a good thing for an opponent, and then try and insert these artifacts and stuff to make it so you can run it through a classifier to show it's obviously fake, and that achieves the same outcome by other means. So maybe that's a sort of flip side approach.
And once you start believing that everything online is fake, I think someone said you don't know what to consume as authentic and what isn't. So in Gabon, the president was sick and he had gone through some plastic surgery, or he had suffered a stroke or something. So he appeared a little odd in a video that they had put out, and people thought that was a deep fake, and there was a military coup in the country. It was an actual video, it wasn't a deep fake. But so that's the dangers of deepfakes permeating into everything. You think that everything could be fake, and then you shouldn't believe anything, even what you actually should believe. So,
yeah, and I do think it is obviously it's concerning the way that it's going to be used and probably will be used in election campaigns and stuff. But to return to the title, I think there seems to be a real interest in the media coverage of deepfakes, in that nuance, jumping straight to the potential that this can have for democracies and elections and stuff, before we've even dealt with the porn issue, which is live and has been since 2017. So I think it's very important that we do need to consider it, but we also need to fix the real damage of the use of it now, which is for porn and internet abuse.
Well, thank you. I think it's been a really great discussion. We've talked about the multitude of harms that can circulate around these issues, and talked about the many different actors that need to be considered for taking responsibility. And I think it's left us all with some food for thought as to how to see these improvements pushed forward in different areas. So can we thank the panel for the wonderful conversation? for your wonderful questions as well. And even though that wonderful smell that's coming down from upstairs is dinner, so we can continue the conversation upstairs. So please join us upstairs for dinner, and we're going to be reconvening down here at 7:15.